Everybody, welcome back to another video lecture. I hope you're doing well. So today we're going to take a look at another religious tradition of sorts, Confucianism. So our reading is from Henry Rosemont Jr., American, 20th century American scholar, thinker, philosopher, specialist on Confucianism and Chinese philosophy more generally, worked with producing translations and, in some sense, really introducing some of the serious engagement between East and West that is becoming more and more widely available these days, but it's still something relatively new, this engagement between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. Although both traditions go back a very long way, and that's not to say there's never been any interaction between them, but really taking these things seriously, from a Western perspective, looking at Confucianism or Taoism or something like that, some of these Eastern traditions, and really thinking seriously about what sorts of lessons they might have, the ways in which they're similar and different from Western philosophy. Is this ongoing project, and it's rather an interesting one. I've taught a course on Chinese philosophy before, and I think there's an awful lot to there. Again, this is an area where, in this particular course that we're doing, I think we could have an awful lot more from, say, East Asian philosophy put in here, but there's only so much time, unfortunately. So we're going to be hearing Rosemont's account, really kind of a summary of Confucianism, what it has to offer us. So there's Confucius, or Kongzi, as he knows. So Confucius is this sort of Western transliteration. You wouldn't catch sort of a native Mandarin speaker calling him Confucius unless they were trying to make themselves clear to a Westerner. So first, Rosemont takes a little bit of time to consider what kind of thinker Confucius was. Was he a philosopher? Was he a religious thinker? The answer is, depending on what you mean, both or neither, as is so often the case when we want to actually get technical and get specific with our questions and what the answers are like. Second, outlines Confucius's relationalism and particularism. We'll get to that. And lastly, explains the Confucian notions of Li, Ren, and the Junzi, and how together these provide an account of a meaningful life. All right, so let's get to it. Now, first, who was Confucius? You've almost certainly heard of Confucius, even if you don't really know who that person is or what exactly he taught or did. And Rosemont makes this claim that, in fact, Confucius may well be the most influential thinker in human history. If influence is determined by the sheer number of people who have lived their lives and died in accordance with that thinker's vision of how people ought to live and die. Now, like many people, many very influential people, Rosemont points to Jesus and Socrates. Confucius didn't write anything. We don't have any extant writings. It's not like he sat down and wrote a bunch of books and that's what we have, and that's why he's famous. Rather, he himself lived an active life where he went around spreading his teachings and engaging with the world around him, and his disciples, his followers, are really the ones who wrote down accounts of what he said and what he did and what he believed. Those have come together and they are called the Analects. So they've been collected into this book called the Analects. Now, this is where we come around to this question, was Confucius a philosopher? Was he a religious person? I think it would certainly be a mistake to call Confucius a religious prophet, if by prophet we mean someone who has some kind of special, almost supernatural knowledge. They've been given some kind of revelation that other people don't. Confucius is not that kind of thinker. He didn't claim to have been visited by any supernatural entities or anything like that, or at least nothing beyond what other people in classical China would have claimed, thinking in terms of spirits and things like this. But depending on what we mean by philosophical or religious, then Confucius and the account of Confucius we get in the Analects is neither. Now, if Confucius and what he says doesn't qualify as religious, if we think religion and being religious requires discussing and dealing with transcendent matters such as the existence of souls, the existence of the afterlife, heaven, God or the gods, their nature, what they want from us, and so on, that is just not what Confucius was interested in. He wasn't here with some sort of message about divine forces and how there's an afterlife and where we're going to. And if you look through the Analects, there's precious little about that. In fact, sometimes when his disciples bring up these sorts of matters, he just dismisses them. He says, you know, why is that really worth worrying about or talking about? Doesn't it seem kind of like a distraction from here and now and leading a good life in the situations we find ourselves in? Now, if we take being philosophical to mean fitting a certain Western paradigm, Rosemont mentions Spinoza and Aristotle and Kant, of having certain first principles, you know, your basic commitments that you outline, you construct some sort of philosophical system, you employ strict argumentation, engage with metaphysics of a certain kind, you know, again, metaphysical questions dealing with the existence of God or souls, the nature of reality. If we think being philosophical involves being metaphysical and producing arguments in that kind of fashion, engaging, in some ways, doing what I've said philosophy is in some of the previous material in this course, if we take that to be necessary to qualify somebody as being a philosopher, then Confucius isn't a philosopher either. So he might not be religious or philosophical if we have a particular sort of narrow view of what both of those things are. But if we take a broader interpretation of religion and philosophy together, then Rosemont claims that Confucius's teachings really are both religious and philosophical because they address the question, what kind of life should I live? And now, if you go and you know, if you want to learn a little bit more about Confucianism, if it's just something sort of new to you, you know, if you just go look it up on the internet and just do some basic reading about it, you'll see that it is effectively a religion. So when Confucius lived, he was quite influential, and over time, so really even during his life, but even shortly thereafter, his thinking became quite prominent in China. And really what, so you know, we're talking 5th century BCE here, Confucianism as a kind of movement, and we can call it a religion. In fact, it is sort of a religion. This is why I say go look it up if you want some more details. It's a religion, but not in the sort of typical Western sense that it's something completely separate from the state, that there are particular churches, there are particular people trained to be a sort of priest of Confucius. It's not like that. Rather, it's a way to live. It's a way to be. It's a way to think about matters. It's a way to approach the world. And really from the time Confucius lived, so 5th, 6th century BCE, up until basically the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, was really when Confucianism declined. And arguably it never really went away, although it becomes a lot more, matters become a lot more complicated and difficult once you have the revolution in China and the Communist Party and so on. But so we can say for over 2,000 years, Confucianism was basically the sort of main religion of China, or perhaps main sort of movement or influence. So if we want to characterize certain Western countries as being in some sense Christian, whatever exactly we mean by that, which I think there's a good question, you know, following the teachings of Christ or being influenced by Christian church or Christian churches, depending on when we're talking. We can talk about China as being Confucian. So for well over 2,000 years, one of, if not the most populous country on earth, was basically run on Confucian principles. And really, what do I mean by that? It adopted Confucius's responses, broadly speaking, to this question, how should we live? Right? What kind of life should we live? And as we've already seen, at least one way to interpret this question, what's the meaning of life, or this topic, the meaning of life. What is it to have a meaningful life? Well, it's to live a certain kind of life. When we're asking that, what's the meaning of life, or is this life meaningful? We're asking, in some sense, I think, at least in one dimension of the question, was that the right way to live? Is that the right kind of way to move through your life? A meaningless life, on one interpretation, is one that in some sense didn't go right. It wasn't lived well. So we've got some sense of who Confucius was now. Religious, philosophical, sort of both, or perhaps neither, depending on exactly what we mean. But if we take religion and philosophy to be concerned, broadly speaking, with these questions of how to live, then Confucius was most certainly both. And Confucius and Confucianism can be engaged fruitfully from philosophical and religious perspectives, where those come apart, as I talked about earlier in the course as well. So, as Rosemont tells us, according to Confucius, we are fundamentally relational, not individual selves. Now, Rosemont tells us that this differs from the contemporary Western view, and in this he's right, certainly in one way, that the contemporary, if not sort of classical Western view from the last few centuries is one that takes an image of the self as being autonomous and individual. We are, by nature, different, right? We're all individual selves that take on or play roles. But ultimately, in essence, what we really are, the true us, who I really am, is something else. It's something under those roles or separate from those roles. So on this Western conception, who you really are is something separate from your relations and what you do. On the Confucian view, Confucian selves live their roles. They are those roles. There's no underlying separable essence from the relations that make up who we are. Rosemont, I think, does a lovely little job talking about identity crises, and he talks about college or university students can often have these sorts of things, depending on where you are in your own life. Going to post-secondary itself is this kind of step, whether you're doing it the first time, whether it's a second time, whether you are sort of fresh out of high school and still relatively young, or older and coming back looking for something different. It's a place of change. It's a place of learning something new, developing yourself in a certain way. It may be something external in the sense that you sort of learn a new skill set, you learn to do something, you gain a degree or some sort of recognition for what you do, but you yourself don't change, right? Not on a deep level. You don't come out the other side thinking, oh, I'm really a different person than I was. But for some people, for perhaps quite a few people, it is a place where that sort of deep change occurs, where you go through and it's not just that you've gotten some kind of recognition or picked up a particular skill, but rather who you are in some sense really has changed. Now, in talking about that kind of crisis, Rosemont says we can really make good sense of what Confucius is saying here and thinking in terms of this relationalism. Who are we really? Well, in the Western view, we are, so I've got a couple of diagrams here. I think this is a sensible way to represent the difference in images. On this Western view, we've got, the self, who you are, right? So it could be, well, I'll just take myself as an example, right? So we've got, say, Carl in the middle here, right? It could be you. And of course, we have all of these relations, right? Parents, family more generally, or friends. I've just have this category of others, and we can put all sorts of people in there, right? Neighbors, my students, right? My colleagues, people I interact with, whoever it might be. We could stick on more bubbles as well. So don't take these four to be sort of representative that on the Western view, it's these 4 things, and that's all that matters. It could be anything, right? Our relationships to projects, to hobbies, various sorts of commitments, whatever it is. On that Western view, you've got the self as this thing that has relations, right? We stand in these various sorts of roles to parents, family, friends, others, right? Colleagues, students, mentors, whatever it might be. But the self is something separate from those. That is, you could change these around, and now that I'm here talking about it, I'm thinking maybe I should have tried to do something with some more animations just to show how these relations can change over time. The relations can change, right? You can change your friends, maybe you can cut yourself off from your family or your parents. Your relations to others will change, and of course that others bubble we could break apart and have all sorts of other relations. So this is a very sort of high level abstraction, right? Relation to others, it's not just others. When I talk about relations, my relations to my students, I can talk about it in a very general sense, my relations to my students. But of course, when we get right down to it, it's my relation with an awful lot of particular people, right? It's you watching this right now, whether or not we've communicated directly. Students who've taken the course with me in the past. It's that many particular relations. When I talk about my relations with students, I can talk about it as this one thing, but I've had thousands of students already. So it's really relations I have with a vast network of people. Now, in the Western view, this autonomous self is this separable thing that's somehow different from all those relations. It's something over and above the relations. Those relations can change, and of course they might have an impact on the self. But the self is something separate from all those relations. We can isolate the self on this view. And this is really what Rosemont's talking about, that kind of identity crisis, because if we cut away all of these other things, right, our relations to other people, to other things, other activities, what are you ultimately left with? Rosemont says, well, really nothing. And that's exactly where the crisis can come in, because if you start going through changes in your life and seeing your relations to all sorts of other important people and important things changing, there can be this real sense of, well, who am I really then? One way of looking at it is that there's some real you separate from all these relations. That's really this contemporary Western view. In contrast to that, Confucius's view, this relational view, is more like this, and this is something similar. There's a similar sort of view, particularly in feminist philosophy in the West in the last few decades, has put forward a view like this as well. This isn't to say, there's nothing new or different in Confucius than contemporary Western philosophy. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to say there have been some views in the West that share this view with Confucius, though they've been, in some sense, minority views. They haven't been the predominant sort of mainstream view. Confucius's view here is really that who we are is made up by our relations to others. So I've still got the circle here. I've taken the coloring out. Now we can see all those lines of intersection really coming together in some sense. Now we've still got the circle for the self, but that's really just sort of showing us this domain where these relations come and overlap. So thinking, just going back to Rosemont, thinking about an identity crisis, who am I? Well, we can answer that fairly easily and straightforward, can't we? Who am I? I'm the son of my parents. I'm husband to my wife, right? I'm your teacher. I'm a student of many other people. I'm neighbor to so-and-so, right? We can articulate all these. Now, of course, we can still say, yeah, but who am I really? Who am I under all that? And precisely what Rosemont's getting at is nothing, right? And on the Confucian view, as Rosemont puts it, Confucius probably just sort of look at you puzzled, right? What do you mean, who are you really? We just went through that. What else are you looking for? What else is there? You're looking for some kind of underlying substratum that stays the same through changes in all these sorts of relations. Maybe you're just looking for a fiction. We could talk a little bit about that maybe some other day, but we're not going to get held up with that here. So for Confucius, we are these relational selves. We're really a product of, or a summation of all of our various relations with others. We're not something over and above all of those relations that we then take on. We have all these changing relations over time, these different points of intersection and so on, but we're really something else. Rather, we just are the sum of these parts. Now, so this is really the relationalism part of Confucius. The particularism part comes in how Confucius approaches activity, our actions, what we do. So, as Rosemont puts it, Confucius focuses on interactions, not actions, and on specific, not general, interactors. So here again, we've got a contrast between sort of mainstream Western philosophy, certainly as Rosemont saw it, and Confucianism, a more sort of Eastern approach. So, we can talk about West and East, we can contrast all sorts of things. In Western philosophy, the predominant concerns in moral philosophy, ethics, these questions about how should we live, what should we do, focus, as Rosemont tells us, on really the agent, action, and motivation. So we can look at a particular agent, who's doing something, but what is it exactly they're doing and why are they doing it, right? Are they acting out of self-interest? Are they making other people happy? Are they just trying to do the right thing? And so it's, in some sense, again, it's very concerned with the individual, the autonomous individual, right? We pick out a particular individual, what is it they're doing and why are they doing it? And that's how most Western moral theorizing, again, not all, but the predominant forms of Western moral theory, particularly moving into sort of 19th, 20th centuries, that was really their focus. But Confucius gives us something different. It's not about specific individuals and what they do and sort of why they did it. Rather, it's on their interactions with others. Right? It's not what you as a single individual do and then this sort of subsequent question of how that impacts other people. But it's what you're doing and with whom, right? And when. It's not about looking at individuals isolated from other individuals and trying to come up with a kind of framework to assess what they're doing. Rather, it's about looking at interactions. It's looking at communities. It's looking at partnerships and relations, taking that really as the basis of our analysis. So Confucianism is interested in what you do. Certainly, your actions matter. But it's not just what you do, it's with whom you do it, right? It's also when you do it, because we are embedded in this network, right? We are always with other people. We're always interacting with other people. We benefit from what they do for us and to us, just as they can benefit from what we do to them. So just coming back to, say, my relationship with you watching this, hopefully, maybe it's optimistic, but hopefully you benefit in some sense from what I do. Right? Whether it be in the lectures I put together, the way the course is designed, what I am guiding you to do in terms of the work in the course, right? The activities I'm trying to get you to do, the writing I'm trying to get you to do. It's not, at least from my view, just a bunch of pointless, motions to try to put you through to, churn out some kind of grade at the end. Rather, my hope and my design with it is that really going through those activities, having them designed in a certain way, having you act in a certain kind of way, having you act with others and on your own in certain ways, really is helpful, is enjoyable, I hope. I hope the course is enjoyable, but I also hope it's beneficial, right? It in some sense makes you a better person. Perhaps that sounds a little, too big, but makes you better in the sense of helps you develop a skill a bit further. Helps you maybe realize something you didn't before. Whether it changes your mind or not, right? Whether you come out of the course with a totally different view on matters, I think that's probably a little too much to aim for. But I hope to be a benefactor to you. Right? I hope you can be a beneficiary from it. I myself have been a beneficiary of many other benefactors. Other teachers, mentors I've had, right? Professors I had. Of course, family, like parents, spouse, all sorts of people. So the main point that Confucius is really getting at, as Rosemont tells us, is that nobody is really just a beneficiary or benefactor, right? We're always both. We're always sort of moving through our lives, taking on different roles, acting in different sorts of ways. And sometimes we are the ones benefiting other people. Sometimes it's other people benefiting us. And there's just no way of being simply one or the other. So for instance, in the relationship with parents, when we're young, we are the beneficiaries of their actions to us, right? They help us. And then as they age, it falls on us to be the ones who help them. Right? And then of course, as you age, so there's a whole cycle of life here, right? You start as the beneficiary of the actions of others, and then, you know, sort of start a life, you benefit from what other people do. Then as you're sort of more capable, you've got more skills and abilities and so on, you benefit other people. And then of course, as we age and, you know, we start to lose, unfortunately, some of our capabilities, we again become beneficiaries of others. And even that seems like a very simplistic analysis, because it seems to indicate that at a certain time in your life, you're either going to be benefiting others or benefited by them. Even that, I think, is a bit of a generalization, because even when other people are benefiting you, you can still benefit them and vice versa. So it's this complex series of interactions. When we think about actions, you know, what we do, what we should do, how we should live and so on, part of the occupation of Western moral ethical philosophy has really been to figure out what's right? What's the standard right action? How do we measure these things? How do you figure out what you should do? But that focuses on trying to come up with one way of interpreting things and figuring out whether or not all actions are right or wrong by some set standard, some kind of principle we can use. Instead, on the Confucian view, no action is simply right or wrong on its own. Rather, it's more a question of what's appropriate to do given a situation, right? Presented with the possibility to interact with somebody else, we have to ask, who are they? Who am I? And what relations do we stand? What should I be doing? How does time matter? How does context matter? So Rosemont gives a couple of very nice examples, which I'll just briefly articulate here because they're a really good way to demonstrate what this means in practice. He says, you know, look, say you've got a roommate who asks you to read a draft of their bad paper. Right? Say it's not very good. Now, you read the paper, and now you're faced with a decision. You've got this interaction on your hands. You need to give them feedback about it. This is why they wanted you to read it. What should you do? Right? What kind of feedback do you give them? Do you sort of rip it to shreds and say, this is a pile of garbage, this is terrible, you know, you just need to go back and totally rewrite this thing? Or you take a softer approach, right? One that's still critical and honest, but one that is couched in somewhat nicer terms. Does it matter, right? Is there really a moral or ethical dimension here? Well, one view is no, not really. You know, this isn't really a moral matter. It's just sort of a question of your tone or something like that. But if we think about ethics and morality much more broadly, just as questions of how should we act in general, well, in this sort of case, how you should approach the matter will depend on really who your roommate is and what the context is. So look, and this is still Rosemont, you know, say you've got a roommate who's having a tough time, they've not been doing so well, you know, on their coursework, or maybe there's something going on in their life. Well, the Confucian response would probably be, you know, be nice about it, right? You can still be sort of firm and try to point out the areas where it could really be improved, but you know, be gentle, right? Be respectful. Say you've got, on the other hand, though, a roommate who's been doing really well. Things have just been going very easy for them, and they're starting to get perhaps a little bit arrogant, perhaps a little bit pompous. In that situation, it might be appropriate to actually throw it in their face a little bit, cut them down a little bit, right? You know, this is garbage. This is no good, right? Why are you wasting my time? Produce something worth reading, and then I'll take a look at it. Right? Both of those reactions might be the right reaction. Right? Both of those approaches might be the right thing to do, depending on who you are engaging with and when you're engaging. And Rosemont points to some examples in the Analects where sometimes, and this is in the Analects, Confucius, a disciple will ask him a question, he'll give one answer, and then later a different disciple will ask a question, he gives a different answer. Now, that might seem like he just doesn't have anything consistent to say, right? Maybe Confucius really doesn't know what he's talking about, or something like that. But as Rosemont notes, and I think he's right on this, if you read the Analects carefully, Confucius gives different answers to different disciples. Why? Because the answers themselves, it's not just a question of having the right sorts of propositions or statements or sentences that we can just sort of spew out and say, well, this is the correct thing, and this is true, and this is what you should do, and so on. But rather, it's about how our words affect people, right? And depending on what another person needs out of us, engaging in interacting with them, right, speaking to them in different sorts of ways can have different kinds of effects. We can tie this back to Nozick just very briefly, where he's talking about the story of the sage at the start. And he says, maybe it's really not some kind of verbal answer. It's not some sort of verbal formulation that we need in answering this question of what's the meaning of life. If a traveler has gone halfway around the world to seek out the wisdom of the sage, perhaps what they really need is the character of the sage, the influence of the sage. It's not about learning some truth, some external thing to us. Rather, it's about shaping who we are in a way. I think this is really what Rosemont is getting at with Confucius as well. And we think about the effects of our communication with other people, not just communicating some sort of abstract set of sentences or something like that. It's not just, like some money or some kind of object you just hand over to somebody. Rather, it's about being a certain kind of way and how our communication can change how we are, right? How we be in the world. Another example, just a quick example from Rosemont, says, imagine you've set up a meeting with a professor to go over a paper, and you go to the meeting, and you find out, right? You go in and there's the professor and they're all upset, and they've just found out that their spouse has had a heart attack and is down in the hospital, and they can't drive, so they're trying to figure out how they can get there. Again, you've got a question in your hands. How do you react? How do you interact here? One answer, which I think we would all automatically know is inappropriate in some sense, it's not the right thing to do, broadly speaking, will be to demand to keep the meeting. No, we said we're going to go over the paper right now. Your spouse is going to have to wait, or your partner is going to have to wait, right? You owe it to me. You said we go over the meeting at the paper at 10 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock, so you're committed. The right reaction is going to be, minimally, to say, okay, we can do it some other time. I realize you have more important things to go do right now. Even better, likely, assuming you drive and have access to a vehicle, right, is to offer to take the person to the hospital. That seems like the right thing to do. Right? Why is it the right thing to do? Because of the situation, because of the context, right? Because of who you are, because of who they are, right? Because of the situation they find themselves in, because of the timing of it all. Right? All of those things matter. So on the Confucian view, on the Confucian approach to ethics, to how we should live, to what we should do, it's not about trying to find overarching general principles that tell us what actions are right or wrong in and of themselves and that we can apply to every situation. Rather, it's about figuring out, in some sense, what really matters and approaching each particular situation with all of that in mind. Each situation presents us with a right thing to do, but the right thing to do depends on what the situation is. So it's not just sort of a relativism. It's not just like, oh, well, do whatever you feel like, do whatever you want. There's no right answer. Rather, it's that the right answer depends on the situation. So we can't find a way of coming up with the general right answer that then applies to every particular situation. Okay, so that's the particularism. So the relationalism is really this view of the self. Who are we really? The sum of all of our relations. The particularism comes in on actions, right? What's the right thing to do? It depends on the particular situation at hand, right? Who are you doing it with? When are you doing it? What's just happened? What's the context? Are you acting as a beneficiary or benefactor? perhaps both in some sense. And we need to keep all of these things in mind. Now, overall, Confucianism is really focused on society. So it's focused on humans, but it's really focused on humans living together in the world. So it's not focused just on individuals, as we've already seen, taken in abstraction. It's looking at us in our lives with others. That's how we live. We live by interacting, right? We live with other people. You know, unless you want to run off and be the sage living on the mountain, or you really take steps to cut yourself off from other people, you're going to have these relationships and these actions. Now, like I was saying just on the previous slide, Confucianism is not focused on, in some sense, big issues, big abstract principles. It focuses on the little everyday things. And in fact, if you go through the Analects and you learn about Confucianism, the ideal that Confucius really puts forward for society is that the best society is one with almost no government. Right? It's one where the little issues are taken. You know, once the little issues are taken care of, you've solved all the little things, the big problems just evaporate. They just sort of disappear. Society will almost spontaneously organize itself once we've figured out what to do in all these little issues. There aren't really any big issues left. Society will just sort of organize itself, and Confucius's ideal ruler is really the best sort of ruler, one who leads by example and is such a good person that in fact other people, just upon seeing how they act and how they lead their own lives, will try to emulate that example. And so the actual business of governing, the way we often think about it, of passing laws and trying to enforce them and rewarding and punishing in certain ways and trying to guide activity in a certain sense, just no longer needs to be done. Because people will just live rightly. Right? They will do the things they should. They will know what to do in all of the little instances that life throws at us. Because really that's the bulk of what life is, right? These little everyday issues. The bulk of life aren't these big controversial questions, well, okay, and, you know, as a philosopher, you might raise an eyebrow. What are you doing? Aren't you wasting your life? It could still be big controversial issues, but, you know, just thinking, so in some sense, I've devoted my life to thinking about those things and talking about them and trying to share them and help other people think about them. But what really is the bulk of my life? A whole series of little everyday issues. Right? Most of the time, I'm not presented with some giant moral quandary. You know, I don't have to choose life or death. I don't have to choose whether or not that one person will live or die versus those 10 other people. Still haven't found that situation. Right? But I do have to think about how to interact with my students and colleagues and family and friends. Right? I do have to make all sorts of small decisions. In making those decisions well, in doing what I should, there just aren't really larger issues to take care of. Of crucial importance in Confucianism is filial piety, right? Which is really, so when we think about piety, we can think about, you know, if we talk about somebody being pious, they really do the sorts of things that religion wants of them. We think about it in those terms, right? A pious person, a pious religious person is one who really takes their religion seriously. They do the things they're supposed to do. Their heart's in the right place. They're really committed to it. The first word, that adjective filial, is really concerning family. That's really what it is. So filial piety is really about your attitude and practices toward your own family. Now, on Confucius's view, the family is absolutely foundational. Again, you know, who we are is really constituted by our relations with others. And what relations are more foundational, more important, more influential on you, particularly at the start of your life, but really your whole life through, right? Than those family relations. So this, for Confucius, it really all starts with the family. And the best kind of state is one that is, in some sense, organized like one large family, right? Where people view themselves as part of sort of one large organic unit. And of course, there are different families within that. But you can think about one large extended family And there's all the different little nuclear families within it, you know, parent, child, brother, sister, right, siblings, and all this sort of thing. So there are these various degrees of separation we have even within families, right, from closest to farther and farther away. And so Confucius, and having this attitude that, you know, we need to focus on the little things first. Focusing on having family operate the right way is really how you start organizing the best society. Now, it goes beyond that, of course, and things get big. But this concept of the li is really important for Confucius and Confucianism more generally. The li, they can be translated different sorts of ways, and Rosemont talks more about this. Rituals, customs, these I think are fine translations. It's really how to do things, right? How, and again, it's not necessarily how to do big things, right? It can be, because of course when we hear rituals and customs, we think often of certain things, right? Certain customs or rituals that are really important for certain events, you know, birth, marriage, you know, death, and so on. But that's not, yeah, you know, of course there are li concerning all of those, but there are many other kinds. So in contemporary Western philosophical accounts of the good life and accounts of ethics and so on, customs, rituals, the li, are almost wholly omitted. They're just ignored, right? More broadly, customs are often, as Rosemont says, seen as purely formal, empty, dead weights of the past, and detrimental to the full expression of individuality. Right? So there can be this attitude, right? This sort of contemporary Western attitude that ritual, tradition, perhaps more broadly, right? Custom, these are bad things. They limit our individuality by confining us in a certain kind of way. You have to act this way and not that way. But they don't have to be seen like that. And on Confucianism, they're not seen as constricting, but rather as a kind of completionism, right? As a way of finishing things, about giving them a kind of proper form. So the li aren't necessarily fancy rituals. Instead, they can be the sorts of basic customs that organize our interactions both with ourselves, with other humans, and with our environment. These li can include things like handshakes, hugs, right? How to greet somebody, how to move through your day. And so look, when I think about the li, there are, of course, there are this, you know, li's governing our social interactions with others. And even if you think, you know, traditions and customs and so on are in some sense bad because they stifle individuality and so on, it's just how we organize our behavior with other people. So when you meet people, there's a certain kind of behavior that's appropriate, ways of addressing people, more or less formal, intimately, and so on. I can almost guarantee that you can be made uncomfortable by people not following the appropriate li, right, at the right time. If people are doing things that are just bizarre and wholly unexpected, it can make them uncomfortable and even feel threatening. So the li are really just ways of navigating the world, sort of grooves that we fall into. We can think about li in a smaller form as well. You know, I can think about, in some sense, and this is sort of stretching the Confucian concept, my own rituals or customs throughout the course of my day. So, you know, when I wake up, what do I do when I wake up, right? How do I navigate breakfast and showering? How does my day go? My day has a certain kind of form to it. Right? There's a certain kind of ritual to it. And now, that's not to say all my days are the same. Rather, there's a certain form within which there is variation. Right? Without the li, without some kind of tradition or ritual or custom, what do we have? Rosemont puts it well. It's really a kind of chaos or randomness. Right? If there was no li at all, we would really have no idea what is going on. We have no idea what to expect. We wouldn't know how to behave properly. Right? We just have no sense of these things. So it's not just about big moral questions and these abstract principles. It's often about little things. The right way to make and pour tea, the right way to have dinner, the right way to interact with somebody, the right way to, say, buy them a gift, or how to behave at a certain kind of event. Right? These are all in the domain of li. So it's really thinking about how we should act in sort of the most encompassing way possible. How should we act at all times, in all ways, with all interactors? Now, mastering the Li, learning what it is you should do and doing it, doing that properly, and having the right motivations in what you do. So not only doing what you should in a kind of empty form, but rather really having your heart in the right place, right? Doing it for the right reasons, doing the right thing and for the right reasons. Ultimately, that is what leads us to Ren. So we've got another, sort of foreign term to interpret, or if you're already comfortable with Mandarin or another Chinese dialect, if you're already familiar with these issues, this might not be something new to you at all. So we've got the Li, these are really the rituals, the things you're supposed to do. Ren is a certain kind of characteristics. Sometimes can be interpreted as virtue, benevolence, right? Authoritativeness is the one Rosemont seems to favor. Ren is in some sense really living correctly. Once you've achieved Ren, you are a good person, right? You're living the right kind of way. You know what the Li are, you know what you're supposed to do, you do that correctly. You know the right thing to do in all circumstances, right? When a situation presents itself, you're not puzzled, you don't have to go to somebody else for advice, right? You have the answer. You can think about it, you recognize this is what the situation is, here is what the Li would dictate, so I'm going to be doing the right thing. And motivations matter as well. So we can know what the right thing to do is and do it, but not really be motivated to do it just because it's the right thing. Ren really leads to the right motives as well. So as Rosemont puts it, it is through ritual that we cultivate and enhance our authoritativeness. But this can only be done as we become full participants in the rituals, expressing our feelings thereby, and thereby in turn investing them, and consequently ourselves, with significance. So an example he uses, suppose a very close friend has a special event coming up, they're getting married or something, and it's appropriate, right? It's custom, it's tradition, it's ritual, it's Li to buy them a gift. Or perhaps it's a wedding gift or birthday or whatever it is. Now, not just any gift will do, right? It has to be a gift of a certain sort of significance. It has to matter in the right kind of way. If it's a very special occasion, it should be a special gift. Now, getting them the gift isn't just about sort of getting them something that sort of checks the box, but rather to really have Ren, right? Is to not only know what you should do to buy them this special gift, it's to want to do it because it's the right thing to do as well. Right? So you don't just do it to save face or check the box or whatever it is, but you want to be a good person. And to be a good person means doing the right thing. And the right thing is just determined by what the rituals are. Now, the rituals themselves are in some sense arbitrary, right? There's nothing about the world that tells us, oh, you have to get people a particularly special gift at a special time in their life, such as when they're getting married. Right? Like, there's nothing about the world that just tells us that's true or that's the right way to live. And so, of course, we could always raise the sort of skeptical questions of, well, how do we know that's right? Couldn't it be something else? Sure, right? And this, again, Confucius just isn't interested in that kind of matter. Couldn't the rituals have been different? Well, yeah, sure, but they're not, right? Even if they're arbitrary, the fact that they exist performs a kind of function. It helps organize society, it organizes our lives, our interactions with each other, our interactions with nature. So even though they're arbitrary, they serve a purpose. And it can be important to make sure those purposes are served, and by all doing it in the same kind of way, we can achieve something. We live a better life than we could otherwise. Okay, so we've got the Li, the customs, the ritual. We've got Ren, this authoritativeness, living well, benevolence perhaps, different ways to interpret it and think about it. This leads us to the concept of the Junzi, or the gentleman or noble person. Literally means son of a lord or son of a prince. This is really the ideal of the Confucian way, the Tao. And if you know of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, same term, the Tao is really the way, right? And you can think of even that when we talk about the way, right, the way to do something, the way to get somewhere, it could be a kind of path or a certain kind of form. So Confucianism gives us a kind of ideal human way, life, Tao. The Junzi, the gentleman, the ideal person, is really one who's fully mastered the Li, and they embody Ren, right? They always know what to do in every situation, and what is proper for them to do, right, and what they're motivated to do depends on their roles. So the Junzi isn't just a noble person or a powerful person or a rich person or somebody in government or something like that, but rather it's somebody who knows exactly what to do, in part because they know their situation. There is a different set of Li, a different set of proper activities for somebody to do who is, say, running a country, from somebody who's, say, running a class, somebody taking a class, right? Being a parent or a child, being a friend or colleague. Right? What's appropriate for us to do depends on who we are and how we stand in relation to others. So Confucianism is particularistic, right, in this sense. What is appropriate to do depends on context, but it's also universal because it holds that that's universally true, that what it's appropriate to do really depends on context, on who we are and the situations we find ourselves in. So there is a general lesson here. There's a model of a good life, right? To lead a meaningful life is really to lead a good life. That's to lead the sort of life that we can lead, one that is worth our time, is important, is fitting for us in some sense. And that's to live according to these ideals. So Rosemont really closes with this. He says, in the cosmic sense, Confucius never addresses the question of the meaning of life. He probably wouldn't even have understood it. But his vision of what it is to be a human being provided for everyone to find meaning in life, a not inconsiderable accomplishment. So Confucius, as a philosopher, religious person, I think perhaps we could just drop maybe even the labels and just not worry about that. Like Confucius as a teacher, as a mentor, as somebody who has something to tell us, shows us a way to live, right? How to live a good human life. It's this kind of model. And again, Confucius really isn't concerned with issues that stretch beyond that. He's not really interested in these metaphysical questions. Do we have a soul? Is there an afterlife? You know, what's God like, or the gods? How did the universe start? In some sense, those questions can be seen as just irrelevant to the good life. Right now, right, a controversial claim there. I'm not saying that they are in fact irrelevant and you're mistaken if you think those are very important questions. But rather, one way to approach these issues, and this is the way Confucius does, is just to say, look, those questions all seem really external to the really pressing questions. And the really pressing questions are the ones that concern what we are going to do in particular situations in our day-to-day lives. Right? If we can figure out the right thing to do in all those little situations, there's nothing really left that we need to figure out to lead a good life. Right? We don't really know where we came from or where we're headed. We don't know those ultimate secrets of the universe. But instead of getting really tied up in knots about those and thinking that the answers to those questions are going to show us how to lead a good life, instead we can focus on issues that we can more directly access and deal with and try to engage with. And so ultimately, Confucius gives us this model. It's particularistic, tells us, gives us a little bit of a template of what it is to do, but what it is that we should do depends an awful lot on our community, right? Our society, our relations with others, the sorts of customs and traditions we have. And maintaining those, so there's a certain kind of conservatism to Confucianism. Maintaining those, living in the right kind of way, fitting the mold, being comfortable with our relations to others, being comfortable with who you are, getting that sense of authoritativeness, not just sort of playing a role or playing a part, taking up a certain relation for a time only to set it aside later and seeing yourself as something else, but rather to be sort of really fit into the groove, I guess would be a way to say it. That is really what it is to lead a good life, and leading a good life in that sense for Confucius would just be leading a meaningful life. Right? These things don't come apart. To be a Junzi, right? To have Ren and to have mastered the lead, is just to be leading a meaningful life, right? To then question, yeah, but why would it be meaningful to do that, right? Sort of like Nozick is questioning last time. Confucius would probably just be confused, right? He would probably also be confused by a overwhelming preoccupation with these metaphysical matters, right? Some of these other domains in the theistic responses. So there's an interesting question here, just within our course reader. This reading from Rosemont is in the section, part 1, the theistic answer. Given everything I've said here, maybe that's inappropriate, right? But then again, Confucianism has been seen as a kind of religion. So there's some real questions there. What do we even mean when we're talking about religion? What does it mean for something to be a religion? Somebody to be a religious thinker? There's more to it than maybe meets the eye. So I'll go ahead and leave this here. I think I've probably been going on much longer than I had initially anticipated, so my apologies if this video dragged a little bit in the middle. As always, you could always speed it up and hear me talk like a chipmunk if you think that would be worth your while. So until next week, I suppose at this point, I hope you're doing well, and you'll see me later, although I may or may not see you if you come to, say, visit me in my virtual office hours. Have an excellent weekend. Bye for now.